We think women need to talk more openly about money because money really matters. It shouldn't be embarrassing or confusing. Join the conversation. We'll be discussing a whole range of topics which will help you get comfortable with your finances. Money Matters. Brought to you by AJ Bell.
Hello and welcome to another AJ Bell Money Matters podcast, the podcast where we talk all things investing and finance and try to help all of you feel better about your money. I'm Laura and I am joined as ever by Danny. Hey Danny.
Hi there, Laura. Hi, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the sunshine while it lasted. But let's be real, this is the UK, and the Great British Summer isn't exactly something we can rely on. And storms of another variety, the market variety, is the topic that we asked our special guest to talk about this week.
Yes, Charlotte Yonge is Senior Fund Manager at Troy Asset Manager, so she knows more than a thing or two about watching market movements. And since we got so many people getting in touch after what can be described as a bit of a market meltdown after US President Donald Trump's April press conference on the White House lawn, when he drew up a chart putting huge tariffs on goods right around the world. So we thought we would get Charlotte to talk about what happened and, crucially, what's happened since and how she handles it when markets see big losses.
She also reminded me of a brilliant term that I'd not heard for a while. I know you hate jargon, Laura, but you're going to have to forgive this one. Diversification.
That's kind of
love
part jargon, part pun, so I think I'll let it.
It is a play on the term diversification, which we have spoken about before and gone through. Making sure that your box of investments is the perfect mix for you and your needs. But if you make changes to your investments, trying to make sure that your chocolate box is full of the right mix of fruit and nuts, and then you end up with investments that aren't actually as good as the ones that you sold to make room and just aren't right for your investing strategy, then you've made things worse. Diversification, not better. And that can be something that people do rush into when they see their investments fall in value during market wobbles like the one we have just seen.
And there is always so much coverage of those market wobbles and far less coverage when markets rebound and recover or when they're hitting highs. So Charlotte's chat is a great listen, and it was also brilliant to get her on because she's founder of a charity called GAIN, which stands for Girls Are Investors, which she set up to try and encourage more women and girls to get into the investment management industry. So definitely something that ties in with what we're trying to do here at AJ Bell Money Matters.
So do keep listening for her interview. Now, though, it is time for our one big thing. And I'm afraid to say that this is something that I've had quite a lot of experience with over the past couple of years, being the mother of teenage daughters, one of whom wants everything now, and that is buy now, pay later. She has used it a lot. I've had to keep real tabs on when she has used it for her shopping because there's always the possibility that suddenly she ends up with 10 different buy now, pay later loans, and they all are due to be paid at once. And she's been really good with it. She's only used it for bigger ticket items. So she used it to buy a mobile phone, she used it to buy a tablet, and she did make sure that it was paid off well and truly in time so that she didn't risk any extra fees or interest or anything like that. Have you used it? I mean, you see it all the time, don't you, when you check out? It's kind of the first thing that you see in your online shopping box.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I feel like every online checkout I go on, which let's be honest is quite a lot, has buy now, pay later as an option, but I've never used it. I feel like I wrote quite a few stories about it when I was a journalist about some of the negative sides of it, people being caught out or getting into accidental debt or the impact it had on their credit report. And I think it maybe scared me off using it slightly. But one day I feel like maybe I should, just as an experiment to see how it works and kind of how that whole process works. But I just worry that I would forget the date that I'm meant to be paying it and get in a muddle.
It's easy to get in a muddle, but no, I've used it a few times, not just for the eldest, but also for me as well. It's just sometimes it can be really useful if you want to spread the payment over 3 or 6 months. And it's just something because it's just one payment. And as long as you're aware that it's just one and you make sure that you clear it off, I think it can be quite a helpful strategy.
And I'm sure lots of listeners out there have used it and certainly know what it is, but we thought it would be useful to kind of run through where the market emerged from and also some recent changes that have happened that might impact those that use it. So let's start with the basics because that's how we roll here at Money Matters, covering all the basics first, just in case you don't know. So buy now, pay later, or BNPL as it's often written out, is that way that shoppers can purchase items, but rather than paying the full amount of the purchase in one go, they can spread payments into smaller amounts over a shorter period of time. It's usually only over kind of weeks or months rather than years and years, like some people might use credit cards for. So it sounds a bit like credit. I like a credit card, I guess, or one of those old store cards that people used to have, or even going further back, the kind of catalogue credit that you might get if you ordered from a catalogue. That one is for our slightly older readers out there, listeners out there. So it is like credit, but it's slightly different because it can be a really convenient way of spreading the cost of shopping. So with a credit card or a store card, you'll get an amount that you can spend, something that's called kind of a line of credit or a credit limit. And you can use that for various transactions. And then you pay it off either in one go to avoid paying any interest, or you pay it off over time in kind of monthly installments and you get charged for the interest on the balance. But with buy now, pay later, your agreement is just for that one purchase, so that one transaction where you're checking out. If you're clothes shopping, for example, that might be a number of different items, but it's just for that one transaction. And typically, the schemes allow you to pay for those items in installments or in one repayment at a later date, and it's interest free. So the repayment plans normally last 12 months or less, and quite often you'll see it marketed as kind of pay in 3 installments, pay in 6 installments. And so you can see how that could be quite useful for people.
Can be useful, but it can also be quite confusing, when you're trying to sort of suss out exactly what you have signed up for. One of the key differences with Buy Now, Pay Later is that you don't get something called Section 75 protection. Now, that protection means that your bank is jointly liable if anything goes wrong with purchases over £100 up to £30,000 made on your credit card. So, say for example, something arrives and it's faulty, or you get a delivery, but you get your card saying your delivery has arrived, but actually it's gone missing somewhere in the ether. And then you can make a Section 75 claim on your credit card to your credit card provider, and you can get your money back this way. Now, buy now, pay later schemes aren't currently covered by Section 75. So if you are making larger purchases, and I know particularly things like holidays, a lot of people will choose to put on their credit cards, so they've got those kind of consumer protections, it is worth thinking about that.
Yeah, that is such a valuable and often quite overlooked protection that credit cards can offer. Another key difference is that buy now, pay later products are currently unregulated. So that means that some people haven't realized that, firstly, it's a debt because it's such an easy way to use it at the checkout and it advertises itself as interest free. And so lots of people don't immediately clock that that is actually a debt. And you can end up with multiple products. So like we talked about earlier, if you have a credit card, you put your spending on that credit card and then you have one bill on one provider to deal with. With buy now, pay later, you could end up with multiple different providers, different payment dates and different transactions with different companies. So that might seem fine until all of the payments become due and you've got to keep track of them. The other thing that people don't realize is if you can't pay it off, it can affect your credit score. And if something goes wrong, because they're not regulated, you can't go to the financial ombudsman to appeal any decisions.
There's been a lot of talk, as you would imagine, about regulating the sector for years. And some consumer groups and charities have actually called it the Wild West, saying that it doesn't protect consumers and it can lead to some people falling into debt spirals or falling into debt because they just don't realize, as you just said. And we know that its use has been increasing exponentially. So we had the Financial Conduct Authority recently published what's called its Financial Lives Survey. It kind of looks at all of our financial habits. And one of the things it reported is that the number of people using buy now, pay later had risen significantly, climbing by 2 million just in the past 3 years, with 11 million people estimated to have used the facility in the past year alone. And of course, we're talking about women and women's financial habits in particular on this Money Matters podcast. And there was a stat in that Financial Lives survey that I wanted to bring you because it's relevant. And it said 35% of women aged between 25 and 34 use buy now, pay later products. And it kind of seems obvious because, we're doing a lot of shopping online, and it's one of those great ways to spread the cost of things, particularly if you're a parent and you've been juggling the cost of living situation. But it's great. It's so great if you use it the right way, if you'll keep track of it, if you're responsible. But a lot of people use cash because they find it's easy to budget. They know when the cash has gone. And it's kind of the same with a credit card limit. If you've hit that limit, then that is that. Whereas if you've hit what should be your limit, but you're still getting buy now, pay later loan on buy now, pay later loan, you can find yourself at a point where you are in some trouble. That sort of sleepwalking into really difficult situations.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that those figures in that Financial Lives survey are really interesting because for a long time this was a booming market, but we didn't actually have any comprehensive figures on how many people used it because there's so many different providers, because it's not regulated. It meant that it was quite hard to get a grasp of how many people use it, how many people get into kind of bad debt or get fined because of it, how many of those debts get passed on to debt recovery agencies. And we're still lacking quite a lot of that information. And I think some of that, it would be really useful to kind of lay bare to people how it can be a useful tool, but it can also be very easy to come unstuck and feel some of the negative impacts of it. But things are about to change because the government's now introduced legislation in Parliament to regulate buy now, pay later products under law. So there's still the exact details need to be worked out and consulted on, but it will include reforming the Consumer Credit Act to update it with new digital ways of borrowing, because that Consumer Credit Act goes back to 1974. And if we think about all of the different ways of how we spend and get credit have changed since then, it's quite dramatic. And in that Consumer Credit Act, there was a little gap which allowed memberships to be paid in installments. So thinking of things like gym memberships, but the same gap is also how buy now, pay later allows you to buy that very expensive pair of shoes to wear to the gym without the usual rigmarole that goes with applying for different elements of credit. So the new legislation will require buy now, pay later lenders to run affordability checks on shoppers so that they can check that you can afford to make the repayments, which I think is quite a basic but very valuable step that's being taken. And it should also include the requirements for providers to give clear and accessible information about the risks involved, because I think those buy now, pay later providers have been very, very good at marketing how easy it is to use, and particularly in the early days were not quite so good about laying out what happens if you don't make those payments and the fines that you could ultimately incur. And that powerful Section 75 protection that we spoke about earlier should include purchases made using buy now, pay later. And it will also allow users to take complaints about any providers to the Financial Ombudsman Service. So if you make a complaint to a buy now, pay later firm and you don't get anywhere with it, you've got somewhere that you can escalate it to.
I think it's also worth saying that a lot of these buy now, pay later firms have been involved in this discussion about creating regulations. So they have been very much on side with this whole process. But as with everything like this, it will take time. So we are unlikely to see the regulation take effect until mid 2026. And I think in the meantime, it is really important that we all take responsibility for our own financial lives. Really think about how many other purchases you have made via these buy now, pay later schemes. When do they end? When do you have to make your repayments by? And crucially, how much are those repayments? I'm still really old school. I like to do pen and paper at the beginning of every month, what's going in, what's going out, just so that I can keep tabs on it. I know you much prefer a spreadsheet. Still not really got to grips with those. But of course, if you don't do that, you can end up in quite tricky situations, because it is debt. You do have to pay it off. And it can be a really hard slog if you end up with high levels of buy now, pay later debt. You could be hit with late payment fees. In some cases, a no or low interest term can become a much higher interest loan, and unpaid debt will probably end up being passed on to a debt collection agency. So also, I think one thing is that in some cases, some of these providers will allow you to pay off your buy now, pay later loan using your credit card. So you're kind of just exchanging one kind of debt for another kind of debt. And if you then get another buy now, pay later loan, then you're just creating this debt mountain.
Yeah, and I think the last thing you want is for a small amount of credit that you took out initially to end up, like you say, Danny, spiraling and becoming this debt mountain where you're just trying to pay off the interest on it and really struggling to repay the original debt. But I think the key thing for anyone who feels like they are struggling, I mean, we've had a long period of price rises, of some people's wages being a bit squashed, not keeping up with that cost of living, more bill increases seemingly coming constantly. It's understandable that at this point, lots of people might be struggling and might feel like they have debt that's just gone past that kind of manageable level. So I think the first thing to say is if you are having difficulties, then don't ignore it. It's a classic cliche, but burying your head in the sand is not going to be helpful. But I acknowledge it does take some confidence and some courage to acknowledge the problem. I think the first thing that people should do is write down all of the debt they have, whether that's overdraft, whether that's buy now, pay later, whether that's credit cards, all of that debt that will be costing them money, and create a list of it so they can at least acknowledge the problem initially and then set about creating a plan of how to pay that off. It's a really good idea as well to talk to a debt advice service. So you could speak to Citizens Advice Bureau and then they will have debt specialists they can recommend you to, or speak to really approved and trusted debt charities. Be very wary because unfortunately out there are some very unscrupulous organisations that will claim to be offering you debt support, but then instead will be selling you something else or selling you other services, and they're not really looking out for you. So really go to one of those approved debt charities, or if in doubt, go through Citizens Advice because they will direct you to a reputable organisation. And remember, just talking about your debt and speaking to some of those providers of your debt won't impact your credit score. And then further down the line, it might be that you want to take on some of those debt solutions after you've researched all your options. They may will do, but ignoring things and hoping they'll go away is not a great solution. But I acknowledge that it is a very tricky situation.
And we do have other podcasts and articles that we've done over the years on the Money Matters website, talking more about debt and how to deal with it. So do take a listen, take a read of some of those. And we will keep tabs on that regulation as it goes through Parliament. So do get in touch if you've got any questions. But right now, it is time for our special guest interview. This week, it's with Charlotte Yonge, who is a fund manager at Troy Asset Management. For those of you who are new to Money Matters, again, we've got articles and other pods explaining what a fund is, what a fund manager does. That is ajbellmoneymatters.co.uk. You can also sign up to our newsletter there, bit of a plug. But briefly, it is someone who oversees and manages investments for their clients, looking at markets, market trends, working out what should go into a fund and what shouldn't.
Yeah, so if you've got a pension or a stocks and shares ISA, also known as an investment ISA, you'll probably have funds as part of your investments already. So they're often made up of a mix of different investments, quite often including shares of companies listed on stock markets around the world. And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that it's been quite a volatile and rocky period for stock markets for a whole host of reasons, but not least the introduction and then U-turning and then more U-turning and changes on tariffs by US President Donald Trump. I mean, I'm struggling to keep up at the moment with where we're at on tariffs. But we thought it would be very useful to look at how our investments have been impacted. So is the volatility over? What should we be considering when we see big headlines about market mayhem? As with everything on this podcast, our chat with Charlotte is not intended to be financial advice, and we always recommend talking to a financial advisor if you feel like you need help with your own individual circumstances. But this is her take on what's been going on, and it's really useful to help you navigate your own financial journey.
Charlotte, thank you so much for talking to us. We wanted to talk to you right now because we've just had something that a lot of broadcasters, papers, headlines, websites have been talking about: market wobble. There were certainly a lot more scary terms used. And I think a lot of people have probably checked their investments in the last few months and noticed that they have gone down, which can be scary. So, you know, what have we experienced? Can you just explain why that's happened?
Yeah, so a few things. I mean, we had what people are calling Liberation Day, some people in the US, on the 2nd of April. That was Wednesday the 2nd. And that was an announcement, one of the worst headlines and I've only been doing this for 15 years, but probably the worst single headline that I've witnessed in that time, which is that the US is going to enact tariffs of unexpectedly high proportions on the rest of the world. And there were 90 days in which to sort of try and solve it. Now, tariffs are not very good because what they incentivize is people to not buy the best or the cheapest, but ultimately to maybe buy less, or maybe to, if you think about US consumers, they're maybe going to, and US companies, they're maybe going to have to manufacture more at home. So what it does is it unwinds what has been a really great period for free trade. Free trade being buy from whoever in the world is most efficient at manufacturing this. It's a sort of the efficient market is in reverse, as it were, if you start putting tariffs on everything. But also life gets more expensive. And if you are a US consumer and you're having to pay 10, 20, 30% more for something, that's not very good for the economy, because it basically means lower spending. So all of these things, but mainly just uncertainty, because this headline came out. We have no idea if it's going to get unwound. We still don't know. And markets hate uncertainty. I'll talk about markets a lot, but people investing hate uncertainty, which I can imagine a lot of your listeners can empathize with. And as a result, often it's sort of shoot now, ask questions later. And a lot of people just sold on this incredibly uncertain, potentially incredibly negative headline. And since then, the headlines have got a little bit better. So I imagine your next question is going to be what's happened since then. But yeah, markets did initially fall a lot, and they've since recovered a little bit.
Because I know certainly when we've been out and about, Money Matters listeners, just generally members of the public, have come up and said, "Oh, I saw my pension fall," or "I had an ISA and the value of my investment fell." And what we don't talk about is when things get better, and we have seen things get better.
That's it. So prices have got better. So the stock market, and I've just looked up the MSCI World, which I know people like to invest globally, so it might be the most relevant for your listeners. But the MSCI World is up 4% this year. So actually, if you kind of gone on holiday in January and come back in May, you'd be pretty happy, made 4% in 5 months. And it was at one point down almost 20% from kind of, if you'd bought in February and then sold at the worst point in April, you would have lost 20. But actually, if you had just sort of turned off your computer and your phone, it'd be fine. And the reason that this happens, and you talked about things getting better, the market, the investment community is really volatile in terms of their psychology. So when we talk about investing, we're investing in businesses, and you're buying a piece of a business. That's investing in shares. That's what it is. So you're buying a piece of a company. So let's imagine Google. So you're buying a bit of Google. What do you think is going to happen for Google over the next few years? It's not an easy question to answer. But if you buy a basket of companies, let's say Google and then Microsoft and then maybe Nestle, I'm using these are all examples of companies that I own in our fund. Those companies over time, if you think they're good businesses, they're probably just going to become bigger, become more profitable as the years go on. There's no way that they're worth, one day worth this and then a few days later worth 20% less, which is basically what happened in April. There's just no way that their value changes that much. But what changes that much is the market's perception of that value. So the market gets really excited and thinks, nothing can go wrong. And then it gets really depressed when Donald Trump comes out and says, the world is changing, and I'm going to take a sledgehammer to everything that's good about free trade. And that sort of really volatile psychology is the reason that things became very bleak and now maybe have become maybe too optimistic. But over time, and if you've got to take this long-term view, over time, if you invest in good companies, then you should, and if you do this in a way that we'll probably talk about it, but if you do it in a way that really does sort of think about all the risks and the things that could go wrong, i.e. not putting all your money in a single stock or something that's really exposed to disruption, for example, then it has been shown that over time stock markets do go up. So your point on things getting better, the headlines have basically got better. I'm not saying that they're going to continue to get better. I think we don't know from here, but if you take a very long-term view, then that's how we approach it. And we were actually buying, and I imagine you're going to ask me about this as well, but we were buying when things were looking really pessimistic in April, the sort of 8th of April. We were buying for the fund that we manage here because we thought things are just very pessimistic right now, and who knows, but it's likely that they may get better.
It's really interesting that you talk about markets almost as if it's a person. So markets get depressed and then they get enthusiastic. And markets effectively are made up of people like all of us. So retail investors, people like you managing funds. And certainly AJ Bell customers, you were just saying that you bought when those shares were looking really depressed. And that's what a lot of AJ Bell customers did as well. Can you explain what's the psychology of that?
So this is interesting. So I do think that in particular, the last few years, people have become aware that if you do buy on weakness, the weakness hasn't lasted very long. So for example, in COVID, I think the bear market, we talk about bear markets when they go down are called bear. That lasted for 6 weeks. So the pandemic was declared at the end of February, and actually the market was going down a little bit before that, but it then troughed. It hit its low point towards the end of March, which is remarkable when you think about it. The pandemic lasted for ages and ages, but the market priced it in very quickly or went too far, and then things started getting better for share prices. Obviously, for people, it took a little longer. And I think what people were doing, AJ Bell clients were probably doing, was saying, "Well, look, it paid to buy then. I'm going to buy this time around because I know that these things recover." The one thing I would caution against, and we take a kind of multi-decade view, is that hasn't always been the case. So, for example, the financial crisis, you had well over a year of the market going down. You go back to the dot-com bubble, and when that burst, it was a few years before the market got back to where it was before. So these things can last a longer time, a shorter time. But if your time horizon, if I'm investing for my pension, or if I'm investing on a sort of 5 to 10 year time horizon, then that allows me to say I'm happy to buy on the 7th of April because frankly I'm investing on a 5-year view, and if it goes down more, we were in a position that we can buy more, and we still are. So I think that's it. It's sort of that gradual incremental approach allows you to take that longer term view as well.
So let's assume that there's going to be more volatility this year. I mean, we have Donald Trump in the White House, and he's very good at sort of throwing things up in the air, and all of us have no idea quite where they're going to land. So when people see headlines about a market wobble, see the value of their investment falling, what should they do?
So I can't give advice. I'm not legally allowed to give advice. And I will just talk about what we do. So understanding that there will always be volatility is the first thing. So there will always be periods where and I feel it. Just because we do this for a living doesn't mean we don't feel it. If I see a stock go down 10%, I find that incredibly painful. I question myself, have I got this wrong? And then I do the work and I look at what's changed and I decide, okay, well, is the company worth 10% less as a result? And I think that's all you can do, is just really understand what you own. And therefore, do you still, even though there's this sort of bumpy ride, do you still have confidence that this is okay on a 5-year view? And I suppose your listeners probably, might be invested in funds rather than stocks themselves, or might be invested in a very kind of diversified ETF or something like that. Do your homework first. You can read. There's so much you can read, and frankly, the process of that I find is just so interesting. And I know lots of people who don't do this for a living, who do it in their free time, who find it interesting. So I'm just going to put it out there that it's a great way to spend your evenings, reading about companies, reading about the world, reading about trends. But no, for example, if you're invested in a fund that sees the world a certain way, perhaps understands that more of the world is moving online, understands that we're going more towards alternative types of, let's say, energy use, whatever it is, whatever that sort of structural trend is. And if you sort of follow that over a period of time, and then when that moment hits where there's a blizzard of negative information, just go back to that initial homework. Does that still stand up? Is that trend going to be intact? Has everything been completely dismantled? And the answer is usually, if you've done the homework properly, it's usually no. But it might be yes. It might be, actually, do you know what? We're not going to go into a world where, let's say, I'm going to go back to what example that we own, Microsoft. Perhaps the world is no longer going to need business software. We're no longer going to use cloud computing, and AI is completely dead. If you decide that, if you make that assessment, then you shouldn't own it anymore. But my assessment of that is that those things aren't true. So you sort of take advantage of the volatility.
Bit of jargon you use there, ETF?
Oh, apologies. Exchange traded fund. So ETFs are ways. They're like funds. They're a way to gain access, often to an index. So you might buy a FTSE ETF or an S&P 500, which is the US stock market ETF, exchange traded fund, and it is a basket. It's basically a basket of underlying stocks.
What you said about the 5-year time horizon, and that feeling when you see things drop, there's often a case of, firstly, panic. Sometimes it's the opposite, it's fear of missing out. And the fact that so much of our investment life is now online, we can look every minute of the day, if we want to, at how our investments are performing in a way that, 10 years ago, we'd probably get a statement once a year through from our pension provider saying, your investment has gone up by X or whatever. Now it's almost too much information.
Yes. I honestly think there's a way to set yourself up so that you have a behavioral advantage. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's actually limits the frequency with which you can look at it. I think because investing is about self-discipline. So if you can construct a framework whereby you actually only look at this once a month, or you you get an alert when something, maybe get an alert when something has fallen 10%. And then you know if you want to buy more at that point, but you're not obsessing about it. Because if you obsess about it, you become very short term. And that's the enemy. The short term is sort of the enemy of having that behavioral advantage of being able to step back and say, I don't care about headlines. I'm 5 years, I'm 10 years.
If people are investing regularly, so setting up a direct debit that goes out once a month into maybe an ISA, a lifetime ISA, or just, buying shares for a dealing account, or like with a workplace pension, there's a certain amount that goes out of your salary, your employer's salary every month. What's the benefit of that?
Yeah, so this is called pound cost averaging. If you put money in regularly on a sort of periodic basis, so let's say it's once a month, and what that means is the average number of, or the average price that you pay will be lower than the average price. And bear with me. So let's say we start the year, the market's 100, we end the year at market's 110, and you say I'm gonna invest £1 every month. When the market goes from 100 to 90, and this is en route to being 110, so I'm just giving you, it's a nice year. We're making money, but the market will have volatility in the interim. When it goes to 90, and you're putting in £1, you're going to be able to buy more than when it goes to 120 on the way to 110. So actually, you end up buying more when the market's cheap versus when it's expensive, because you're putting the same pound amount in. And that's amazing. It's called pound cost averaging. And it's great because it just sort of takes away the decision as to when you need to do it. So it's sort of automatic. You don't really have to think too much about it. But it means, for example, as well, in that, let's say your April subscription was when the market was on its knees earlier this year. You don't have to say, oh, I don't know whether to buy or not because I'm really scared like everyone else. If you've got that automatic, again, it's putting these structures in place to stop you from being, what did Donald Trump call them, panicans? Yeah, I think he couldn't think of the word for panicker, so there's a new word apparently now, which is panican. So if you don't want to be a panican, and therefore just having that structure in place sort of almost forces you when you least want to. And there's this phrase in investing, when you should be buying, you won't want to. And it's true. You won't feel like it because the world will feel like it's ending. March 2020, the world felt like it was ending. That was the best time to be buying stocks. So if you've got something automated that forces you to do it, I think behaviorally that's really good practice.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I love panicans. The other one that I loved from Donald Trump was yippee.
Oh, I missed that. What was yippee?
Yippee. So you've got the yips, but instead of saying they've got the yips, he said the markets were getting yippee. And I was like, yippee! I don't think so.
Yeah, he's got it wrong. As often. That's brilliant.
So you were talking earlier about diversification.
Yes.
About having lots of different things in people's investment baskets. If we were to use the jargon, we'd call it a portfolio. So why is that important?
Yeah, so again, we kind of spoke about owning one like let's say you own one stock. Now, if you get the stock right, that's fine. But if you look over time, and I don't have the numbers at the tips of my fingers here, but I know that it's the vast majority, and whether it's sort of 90% over, if you look over decades and decades, actually the vast majority of big companies don't stay big because there's disruption, the world changes. Even just going back and thinking about Nokia, or you think about companies that you might have owned when we were getting really excited about, let's say, the internet era, and companies that actually didn't survive it. You can think about businesses like Enron, where there's an accounting scandal. There are all these companies which, you think that's pretty large, pretty diversified, I'm going to be fine. Even the best analysts, the professionals who are investing in those, they get it wrong all the time because the world's uncertain. So you really shouldn't, and again, I can't give advice, but we think about it from our professional standpoint, we really shouldn't put all of our eggs in one basket. and therefore owning a number of good ideas, of which at least we think the majority, and over time the majority have been successful ideas, is all you need to be a good investor. You won't win with every single one, and that's the inherent uncertainty of it. So there's definitely something to be said, and there's sort of data and empirical research behind this, but you want an amount of diversification, an amount of variety in your portfolio. There's also arguments which are completely right as well, that you don't want to over diversify or diversify for the sake of it. Some people talk about diversification, and that's kind of, oh well, I should just buy more or different types of companies which frankly are less good for the sake of it. No, actually you can dilute your best ideas by doing that as well. So look, I kind of want to come back to thinking about the standpoint of your listeners, which is probably they're going to be invested in funds, i.e. other people like, and I don't know, but I would assume a lot of them will be thinking like that, i.e. invest in a managed fund, something that is being run day to day by a professional, and all of those will have a number of holdings already. So there's diversification within that. Same if you were to buy the exchange traded fund, the ETF. That's usually a basket of companies, often an index like the FTSE. Again, there's diversification, but doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go up either. So I suppose thinking about from that standpoint, you probably don't want to just have one fund either. Let's say you will put all your money in the Trojan Ethical Fund or the Trojan Fund, which I run. If I get it wrong, then I'll feel terrible, but also we would never advise anyone to put all their money with one person either. That person at a point in time may get it wrong, and may get it wrong over a number of years. So you kind of want to manage that, and really make sure that you diversify your manager risk as well. So putting all your eggs into someone's basket. Think about maybe a few people as well. I think that's how diversification generally would work.
It's fascinating that you used a Nokia there as an example of a company that, I mean, for a while it was absolutely all the rage, wasn't it? That Nokia phone, and you would just text with a couple of thumbs, and now the world has moved on, and the computer in the palm of your hand looks entirely different, but you could never have imagined that was going to be the case.
No, exactly. And something seems so entrenched, so established, and then boom, you just can't predict. You've got to look back over the last 25 years. The iPhone was only launched in 2007. We didn't have apps. App economy didn't exist. So all the time, new business models are forming, are gaining traction. There are they're going to be unforeseen ways of living that you just can't predict today. So you got to be really alive to that as an opportunity, but also a risk.
It's been brilliant talking to you, Charlotte. Thank you so much.
That was Charlotte Yonge from Troy Asset Management. And as we said earlier, she's also co-founder of the charity GAIN, which stands for Girls Are Investors, which she set up to try and encourage more women and girls to get into the investment management industry, something that we are obviously 100% in favour of. Breaking into those still male-dominated industries is definitely a good thing. And one thing I'm definitely 100% in favour of is hearing our guests' confession. So Danny, did Charlotte share one with us?
She did, and you probably won't be surprised by this one because it echoes what so many of the women who work in financial services often say about their own finances. Before I let you go, we ask everyone a question at the end of our podcast, which is we ask them for either a financial dilemma or a financial confession.
I think mine is, I will often be underinvested in my own portfolio, so I will often just pay more attention, frankly, to running our clients' money, which is probably what people want to hear. It's not really what my family want to hear. So I'll just, and I do invest a lot of as a proportion of my own portfolio into our funds at Troy, but I also will have uninvested part of the portfolio, which frankly I should just be putting straight away, or at least pound cost averaging into something. So that's really boring. I wish I'd blown it all on a trip to Disneyland. That sounds way better. But that's my confession. I suppose now that I've got 2 sons, so and subscribing to an ISA is obviously something that kind of think about, and they have junior ISAs, which they're not going to thank me for if I just don't invest it.
Yes, I think, what's the old saying? It's like doctors make the worst patients. I think that is also a similar vibe here, isn't it? And I think there's an element where if you're doing it every day, you're talking about investing, you're investing money every day, probably the last thing you want to do when you get home, you've got the kids to bed, you've had dinner, you've done the earning, is sit down and think more about investment. So I can relate to this one, but her children will probably thank her if she does sort out their junior ISAs.
Yes, it's one of those sort of issues I think a lot of people get. I would imagine it would be a bit like a hairdresser. You get home and your mum or your sister turns up after you've been on your feet for 10 hours and said, can you just do me a quick colour? Yeah, you probably would be a bit like, actually, can you just pour me a glass of wine? But there we go. That is it for this episode of the pod. Our next episode, we've got a brilliant guest, best-selling author and Jungian money coach, Linda Davies. She's had an incredible life, so I'm really looking forward to hearing all about her and how our psychology affects our financial lives.
I'm so interested in that one. I love that topic. We had Laura and Moore on a previous podcast, didn't we, talking about how your kind of childhood and your family affects your approach to money. So that's definitely a good warm-up if you want to go back and listen to that one before our next episode with Linda Davies. But until then, do get in touch with us via email. We're on hello@ajbellmoneymatters.co.uk or via our social media. You can find us on all the usual places: LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and X, where we are at AJ Bell Money Matters. And until next time, thanks for listening.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell. The podcast isn't telling you if a certain investment is suitable or not. Don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that how you're taxed will depend on your individual circumstances, and rules can change. The way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.